20 years, China poured hundreds of billions into Africa, building roads across deserts, industrial parks and wastelands, and even buying land as if it were their empire's backyard. But today, that image of prosperity is collapsing. In July 2025, Chinese social media was shaken by videos from Angola. Not peaceful protests, but mobs storming Chinese neighborhoods. Doors were smashed, shops looted in daylight, crowds shouting with nothing left to lose. Once protected compounds with guards and private restaurants could no longer hold back the anger. Within seconds, stores were stripped bare. In Kenya, fear struck immediately. A Chinese trader recalled how their bus was stopped after leaving the airport, tires slashed and crowds closing in. "We were terrified," he said. This wasn't a land of opportunity anymore. It was pure rage. In Luanda, the phrase zero-cost shopping spread, a grim term for Chinese-owned shops looted without protection. Merchants lost everything, praying only to survive. When Angola hiked fuel prices by 33% on August 1st, taxi drivers went on strike and protests spread like wildfire. Barricades went up, supply chains froze, and anger turned toward Chinese businesses. Factories burned, supermarkets smashed. Behind shuttered doors, Chinese families reinforced roller gates with barbed wire and hired armed guards. But resentment only grew. Protesters demanded local workers be expelled from Chinese-owned shops to cut off the arms and legs of their bosses. The message was clear. It was no longer just about economics, but survival. This fury had been building for 2 decades. The gap between wealthy Chinese enclaves and struggling locals grew too obvious. Air-conditioned offices and private guards on one side, daily hardship on the other. When the fuel hike came, it lit a fire no one could stop. Chinese businesses froze in major cities like Luanda, Wambo, and Lobito. Shops stayed dark, workers were sent home, and fear took over. And the unrest didn't stop at Angola. In Zambia, tragedy struck. Ms. Xu, a former broadcaster from Hunan, who had built a farm and lived simply among locals, suddenly disappeared in early August. Just days before, she was happily sharing harvest photos online. Then everything went silent. Friends later found her home abandoned, her animals left unattended, and weeks later authorities confirmed the worst news. The suspect, shockingly, it was her own farm manager. He vanished with her car, passport, and belongings, leaving behind unanswered questions and a trail of anger. Even more chilling was the police warning this was not an isolated case. In 2025 alone, several incidents involving Chinese nationals pointed to the same pattern. Trusted employees, from guards to drivers to housekeepers, turning against their employers. Resentment over layoffs and pay cuts simmered quietly until it erupted into betrayal and violence. Security experts began to sound the alarm. Many Chinese businesses in Africa had built fences and hired guards, but neglected the people inside. Low wages, no background checks, no trust building. They locked their warehouses, but the real danger already held the keys. Then came Mali, the next flashpoint. Billions poured into mines, but instead of protests, armed groups appeared. On June 1st, extremists stormed a cement plant in western Mali. Buildings burned, 1 Chinese engineer and 3 Indians were kidnapped. Days later, another mining site was torched. Trucks destroyed, offices in flames. The attackers did not steal. They left one message: leave. On June 20th, the Chinese embassy issued an unprecedented order. All companies must withdraw from high-risk areas. It wasn't just a warning, it was an admission that control was lost. For Chinese workers on the ground, the change was stark. "A Chinese passport used to be a shield," one businessman in Bamako said. "Now I hide it under my shirt." Another admitted, "I pretend to be Korean or Japanese." Nationality here has become a liability. At border checkpoints, they faced special processing fees with no receipts. Locals called it a body tax, the price of privilege. From Angola to Zambia to Mali, the pattern was the same. Not nationalism, but fury. Anger at years of promises that felt one-sided. China entered Africa under the slogan of win-win, but many locals now say they only see one side winning. On Chinese social media, the reaction split. One side burned with anger. "We built roads, schools, jobs. Why are we treated this way?" The other asked sharper questions. Did those projects truly help ordinary people, or only enrich elites? Did anyone care how locals actually lived? This is no longer just about broken contracts or burned factories. It is about broken trust. Across Africa, fear in Chinese communities is shifting from profit loss to survival itself, whether shops will be looted, whether staff will betray them, whether tomorrow they can still stay. Some quietly book flights home. Others, tied down by factories and property, remain trapped between danger and retreat. Their greatest mistake? Copying China's cost-driven model: cheap labor, little respect, no bonds. That neglect is now turning workers into their biggest threat. As one business owner admitted, if they hate what you represent, no one escapes. China, as the world's second largest power, could have been a true partner, listening, sharing, helping others grow. Instead, what many locals saw were one-sided contracts, debt, and control. From looted shops in Angola to collapsed projects abroad, one truth is becoming clear. When development feels like a facade, people will no longer stay silent. The flames of protest will not die out. They will spread. At the start of 2025, Indonesia was rocked by turmoil. On May 13th, over 100,000 protesters filled the streets of Pati, Central Java, demanding the resignation of Regent Sudegu over accusations of arrogance and failed leadership. The Pati People's Solidarity Alliance put forward 5 demands, from protecting ancient mosques to opposing wasteful projects and controversial school reforms. When Degu appeared, tempers flared. Demonstrators clashed with police, smoke filled the air, and government vehicles were damaged. Dozens were hurt, several detained, but Degu refused to step down. The regional council began an inquiry, while thousands vowed to keep the pressure on. Just days earlier, another storm had erupted in Sulawesi. The Morowali Industrial Park, the world's largest nickel hub, backed by Chinese investment, saw angry crowds surge through its gates. Warehouses, offices, and vehicles were damaged as workers protested what they saw as discrimination and abuse of power. Production lines froze. Police locked down the entire area, and Indonesia's role in the global nickel supply chain hung in the balance. Morowali was no ordinary site, a joint venture between Indonesia's Bintang Mining and China's Tsingshan. It produced over 40% of the world's nickel for EVs and clean energy. Any disruption threatened a global domino effect. Beneath it all, resentment grew. Locals earned a fraction of Chinese workers' salaries, while the best jobs stayed out of reach. Anger escalated into petitions, with even 328 retired generals demanding change. Jakarta faced a painful choice: protect Chinese firms and risk unrest, or side with the people and lose tens of billions in investment. As Morowali simmered, strikes spread nationwide. A wage dispute at a shoe factory left over 1,000 suddenly jobless. On social media, workers poured out frustration. 9 years of loyalty, and now nothing. Then came the biggest blow. Steck Group, a textile giant with 6 decades of history, collapsed on May 1st, laying off 20,000 workers. Silent machines and shuttered gates became symbols of a deeper crisis. The roots ran deeper, cheaper. Automated Chinese factories undercut local industry. The U.S.-China trade war shifted contracts to Vietnam and Thailand. Exports shrank, strikes erupted across Java, Batam, and Bekasi. Families lost homes, children's tuition, even daily meals. Government aid was too little, too late. By mid-May, the crisis turned political. Jakarta froze 127 Chinese projects worth over 1 trillion yuan. Some called it defiance. Others warned it was the breaking point. China's Belt and Road projects, from mining to high-speed rail, were now lightning rods for anger. On social media, hashtags surged, Indonesia for Indonesians. Protests spread across provinces. Banners accused Chinese companies of taking land, jobs, and futures. Tensions rose as international investors began to back away. Japanese, Korean, and European corporations paused expansion. Capital outflows hit the rupiah, and the stock market shuddered. Analysts warned GDP could shrink by 2% within a year if the standoff worsened. President Prabowo was caught in an impossible bind. He needed Chinese capital for his Golden Indonesia 2045 vision, but also leaned on U.S. military ties to balance regional geopolitics. Massive projects worth $58 billion hung in limbo. The Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, once a proud symbol of partnership, was now bleeding over $1 million a day. Power plants, ports, and mines face similar risks. By late May, the nation was trapped. Chinese funds frozen, streets restless, global investors on edge. And as Indonesia struggled, another storm loomed, the slowdown of China itself. Reports from international organizations painted a stark picture. In July 2025, China's industrial output rose only 5.7%, the weakest in 3 years. Retail growth slowed to 3.7%, investment barely moved, and real estate collapsed 11%, dragging its GDP share to historic lows. A faltering China meant an even shakier Indonesia.